Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is the 28th day of September in the year 2016. It is an absolutely gorgeous Wednesday, a kind of a fall day. The temperature this morning was 60. It's probably up near 70 now. Sun shining, clear, low humidity, absolutely the weather that people dream about. It is absolutely gorgeous. And as I think back, we've had a pretty good September here in Appalachia. Of course, I won't even think about the June. We had an awful June with floods and such. But to be honest with you, we haven't had any rain since, and now we need it. We're reaching the point where the leaves are going to start to come down, and if we don't get some moisture in the soil, we're going to have a forest fire issue. That'll be the next thing. But again, I worry about that in another day, because today the weather is absolutely gorgeous. I hope that you are well and that your day is going well, and I thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the Head On Radio Network. Bob Kincaid and his folks, Agnes and those folks do a great job, and I know they've been getting your support for a number of years, and they continue to do it. You ought to be credited for keeping this important network on the air. And, of course, if that network wasn't on the air, I wouldn't be here either. So I really do thank you for your continued support, your loyalty to the program, and your willingness to tune in day after day after day. And, again, sometimes I appreciate the fact that sometimes seem to be more effective than others, I realize, and I can tell that from my own perspective. Some days at the end, I just don't feel that things clicked, and it would, and the things I wanted to get across came across. On other days, however, it's just the opposite, and I get so excited I'm tingling, and I really feel like things clicked, and the points I hoped to make, I was able to make, and hopefully that'll be one of the days we have today, hopefully. This is our third broadcast of the week. As you know, we are on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday each week here on the Head On Radio Network. So today, being Wednesday, we are scheduled for our full 2-hour program. I do invite you to participate actively in our program. There is so much going on. Of course, we had the presidential debates on Monday night. The fallout from those debates continues. We'll get into that and make a few comments about that in a moment. Then we'll get into today's program, and I think I announced yesterday, and I'd like to follow through with this because I've been kind of sitting on this now for about 2 weeks. I'd like to do something with the issue of affirmative action, and more specifically, the protests of Colin Kaepernick in the NFL when he refused to stand for the national anthem. And now he's had a number of other folks, not only from football, but in other sports as well, protest with him. And the debate within the sports world still goes on as to whether, in fact, this is something he should have done, should not have done. I don't think anybody questions his right to do it. That's a constitutionally protected right, as you know, under the Bill of Rights. But the fact of the matter is, in terms of logistics, there has been a lot of debate on that particular issue and on his particular stance, and whether, in fact, there is even some question that one of the reasons that he's been relegated to second string on the San Francisco 49ers, some of the pundits are beginning to suggest that his head is so much into the social and political issue that he's really not been able to devote his full attention to playing football, and that it is having an impact on his performance on the field. And so consequently, Blaine Gabbert has assumed the role as starting quarterback on the 49ers. It's hard to pin that down one way or the other, but the point is that Kaepernick has begun a movement that has drawn some significant support from a number of different perspectives and a number of different areas within sports as well as outside sports. It is a debated issue, and I thought that we really ought to devote some time to it today. So one day. So I would like to kind of devote today to do that. But I do invite you to participate and to raise questions or make comments about issues of the day that concern you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you're willing to trust me to get your ideas or your thoughts on the air, I would be glad to do that if you send them to me in an email. Just drop me a line at waobrien906@gmail.com. That again, waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I do invite you to check regularly on our Facebook page. If you go to the search box on the homepage for Facebook, just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will be into our Facebook page. And on that page, I have placed a number of postings on some of the issues that we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center, on a few of the issues that maybe we didn't devote as much time to, but I felt that they would be well worth your time in reflection. And then more important, or more frequently than anything else, is an article or a piece that I run across in my reading that I think might be of particular interest to you. So I basically copy the link and post it on our Facebook page. So again, if you go to Facebook to the homepage and you type in the search box, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have an opportunity to react to a number of these postings. The latest ones, the most recent ones, come first, and then they basically go, work their way back from there. So there have been, over the last 7 or 8 days, there have been 8 to 10 postings on a number of issues, many of them related to the campaign, some of them related to issues we've been talking about here at the Virtual Center. I know that yesterday, just prior to yesterday's program, I posted a quotation from Enrico Marotti, the economist from Stanford that we were focusing on yesterday, and his book on the geography of jobs, and his idea of so-called brain hubs, or brain clusters, if you will, those areas of the country. And I want to go back and just touch on one or two more things about that before we finally leave it. Then I would also like to go back and make a few concluding comments about the truthout.org article that we were focusing on toward the end of our program yesterday, on the issue of the so-called gig economy and the transition in the new capitalist system of the idea of transitory part-time work, and the extent to which we are returning to the kinds of situation and the kinds of problems for workers that ultimately led early in the 20th century to the creation of the move for organized labor and the idea of the growth of unionization in the country. And I think one of the comments that I made toward the end of yesterday's program was the fact that I really do believe that what is contained in this article about the so-called gig economy, and I'll go back to that in a moment, it seems to me can be very worthwhile for organized labor in this country, because it seems to me there is both a need that has surfaced and an opportunity to really breathe some life back into the union movement in this country. I think it is very important, and I think the situation is one which seems to call for it. Just a comment or two. We're still getting the fallout from Monday night's presidential debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. I think most of the pundits have concluded, even the Republican ones, have concluded that it appears that Hillary really won that debate hands down. That is despite Donald Trump's assertions, continuing assertions, that he really won the debate. And his informal polls validate his victory, according to him. And of course, he appeared yesterday morning on Fox and Friends, the morning after the debate. And but in the process, Mr. Trump has employed or adopted several reasons or justifications for problems that he encountered in the debate. He blamed the moderator, Lester Holt, claimed that he really was much harder on him than he was on Hillary. He blamed the microphone and the fact that even in one particular situation made reference to the fact that his microphone was sabotaged. And of course, that's tied up with the sniffling and sniffing that he did, especially during the first portion of the debate. A number of people suggested the possibility of cocaine use because it appeared to be something like that. But be that as it may, he has employed a number of justifications. And of course, his campaign advisor, Kellyanne Conway, made the rounds the following morning, yesterday morning, on the TV talk shows, and basically tried to cover up and justify some of the things that Donald Trump said or didn't say during the debate. It's kind of damage control after the fact, if you will. And in some cases, her positions were a little bit extreme. On my Facebook page, my personal Facebook page, a longtime friend of mine, this is a fellow that I taught with in the early 1970s, so we've been friends for upwards of 45 years. And he now has retired. He was an attorney, in fact was a staff attorney for Northwestern Insurance, and retired a few years ago and is now living in central upper New York State. And he made the point that, on Facebook, on one of his comments, that Donald Trump is saying a thing about the debates, and he said this may be one of the few times that Donald Trump and I actually agree on something. And he said, I agree with Donald Trump. There was something wrong with his microphone that was turned on. In other words, people could hear what he was saying, and that was the problem. But anyway, so the fallout continues. I think there's every indication in the world that Hillary Clinton's campaign will probably get some sort of a boost in the polls from that performance. But on the other hand, the second such debate is scheduled for October 9th, so not too long before they go at it again. And already Donald Trump is promising to hit harder and more often in the second debate than he did on the first debate. And of course, he made the comment that he was going to say some things, but he didn't want to be perceived as being unkind, if you will, by going back into the 90s and the shenanigans of Bill Clinton when he was president. And Donald Trump said that one of the things that bothered him is that Hillary's daughter, Chelsea, was at the debate and he didn't want to embarrass her or make her feel bad or whatever. So for a number of other reasons, he basically implied that he pulled punches during the first debate, but that he wouldn't do that in the second one. One of the things that I wanted to call your attention to, it's in today's New York Times, is some behind the scenes maneuvering and planning going on in the Trump campaign, which really revolve around the fact that for the second debate, the Trump advising team has pretty much concluded that this time they're going to have to better prepare him for the debate, that he missed opportunities. And I think we talked about one or two of those in yesterday's program. He missed a few opportunities. So while publicly they're going along and agreeing with Trump that he won the debate, in private, their behavior and internal comments suggest that they recognize that he didn't do as well as they had hoped he would do in the first debate. and that they're making plans for the second one. So with all of that, I think the fallout from the campaign continues, and there's no question by the time we get into the weekend, I think that we're going to begin to see evidences of a boost in the polls for Hillary Clinton. But of course, these things are fleeting. They don't last long. And as we'll recall from the Democratic convention, Hillary came out of the convention with a large lead. Many people thought during the first week or so after the convention that the election was just about won by Hillary Clinton. The Democrats, there was some talk not only of winning back the Senate, but even the possibility, remote as it is, of taking the 30 seats necessary to retake the House. Now with the polls showing the race at the time of the debate, showing the race about even, and a few polls actually showing Donald Trump a little bit ahead, we don't hear that kind of talk anymore. And so I think that, the polls are vulnerable. They go up and down, obviously. But there's absolutely no question that she did get a boost out of the first convention. Her performance was pretty solid, I thought. And one of the things that impressed me was the fact that she looked good. She looked vibrant. She looked alive. She looked alert. She obviously was well prepared. And so anything that could have gone wrong for her in the debate did not go wrong. I think she performed as people assumed or expected her to perform. And anything less than a superb performance on her part would have been considered a failure. So in that sense, I think the bar was a lot higher for her than it was for Donald Trump. We talked about that yesterday. So if you have comments or you have issues or things about the debate or about the election itself that you feel our listeners would benefit from hearing, then by all means, I do invite you to take advantage of the opportunity. That's why the phone is there. Ultimately, the more interaction and the more discussion that there is, as opposed to, the more dialogue rather than monologue, I guess is the proper expression, for a program like this, the better. So, if you are inclined, by all means, pick up the phone and dial 304-663-4676. Bob Kincaid is in the studios. I think you'll get him if you call, and he'll get you on the air immediately. He'll notify me that you're there, and we will begin our conversation, and you will have your opportunity. We would love to hear from you. So by all means, please don't feel that you're interrupting a program or interrupting me or anything like that. So with that, I mentioned that there are a couple of follow-up comments that I'd like to make on a few of the things we've been dealing with over the last couple of days. One of them is the focuses on the issue of economic development, and more specifically, the so-called brain hubs or innovation clusters, he calls them in his book, The Geography of Jobs, in the research of Enrico Moretti, the economist at Stanford University. And in looking at some of the reviews of his book, I picked up on a couple of things that we didn't mention that I thought you might find informative and helpful, because they probably are responses to a question that you had if you were with us yesterday during the time that we spent on this particular issue. And that is the nature of these brain hubs or innovation clusters. What causes them? In other words, what's the difference between areas where innovation seems to grow of itself and just seems to expand, whereas in many other areas, that kind of internal organic growth doesn't seem to happen? What causes these innovation clusters to emerge? And in response to that, Moretti has three reasons he believes, three things that need to happen in order for these so-called clusters to form and to take off, to become self-sustaining, as it were. He talked in his second chapter in this book about the city of Detroit and the fact that in the auto industry in the 50s and 60s, Detroit appeared to be such an innovation cluster, such a brain hub, because anybody and everybody that was associated with the automobile industry seemed to believe that they had to be in Detroit, that that's where all the action was, that's where all the brain power was, that's where the investments, that's where the innovation, that's where the creativity, that's where the conversation. And so anybody that was involved or wanted to be involved in the automobile industry was almost pressured to find a way to get to Detroit. But as he points out in his book, that didn't last. It didn't sustain itself. When overseas competition in the auto industry emerged from primarily at first Japan and then South Korea, of course, with Hyundai, as that competition took off, the auto industry and the brain power associated with it in and around Detroit seemed to peter out. So the question is, and Enrico Moretti takes this on, what causes these clusters? What do these so-called brain hubs have that other municipal centers that seem to show all the promise of becoming a brain hub don't quite make it? He says that one of the factors is what he calls a thick labor market effect. If you're really, he said, in a very highly specialized position, you want to be in a labor market where there are a lot of employers looking for workers and a lot of workers looking for employers. The match between employer and employee tends to be more productive, more creative, and innovative in thicker labor markets. So what he's talking about is what he calls thick labor market effects. And what that means is there's more going on in the area of employment. There are more people looking for skilled workers, and there are skilled workers looking for employment opportunities. And that kind of vibrant environment seems to be essential in Moretti's research to fueling these innovation clusters, so to speak. A second area is not directly in the hottest fields, but the subfields surrounding them. He says it's the same kind of thing for what he calls vendors, the providers of intermediate services, not those that are directly involved in the innovation industries, but the secondary areas and opportunities that feed off these clusters. And basically what he talks about Silicon Valley as the example. And he said in Silicon Valley, besides the technology innovators, the brain power, if you will, that draws some of these largest IT companies and whiz kids, so to speak, to the Silicon Valley, you tend to find very specialized IP lawyers, lab services, shipping services that focus on that particular niche of the industry. In other words, those support services that need to be available in order to sustain the growth are available. You get the legal talent, you get the service area talent, you get the support systems building up. And so ultimately the whole thing interacts and kind of becomes an innovative community in and of itself with its own sustaining life, as it were. And then the third factor, Moretti says, that seems to be essential for these so-called brain hubs is what economists refer to as human capital spillovers. The fact that people learn from colleagues, random encounters in coffee shops, at parties, from their children, and so on. The whole idea, Moretti says, there's all sorts of what he calls sociological evidence that this is one of the attractions of Silicon Valley. It's the place to be. It's the place you want your kids to grow up in, because the contacts they make, the kids they go to school with, the clubs they belong to, the sports they engage in, the books they read, all of these things feed into the kind of growing, expanding environment that make that particular region a place where the action is. And the fact of the matter is, while that's going on, you couldn't envision leaving it or being anywhere else. That's where you need to be. That's where you want to be. That's where you want your kids to be. And that kind of feeling, which covers a number of different areas, unlike Detroit, it's not just the automobile industry. This is a number of different areas together. The growth and it becomes a self-sustaining opportunity. It's almost organic. It almost assumes a life of its own, so to speak. Moretti says these are the factors that really are necessary for these clusters to go on. But he admits that they are not sustainable forever. And again, he uses Detroit as the example. He said, I have a chapter in my book on the difference between Detroit and Silicon Valley. This region has kept reinventing itself in ways, he says, that are remarkable. At one time, it was all orchards. Then it became all hardware. Then it became all software. Now it's becoming something else. Social media and biotech and clean tech. These types of clusters don't survive big negative shocks. So they basically are shielded and protected and allowed to grow by the kinds of positive things that are going on around them. And he gives a number of specific examples of this. And I had mentioned yesterday that he touches on a number of examples of these kind of brain hubs, so to speak. Let me share with you the ones he mentions. He said, for example, typically these clusters tend to be very specialized. Silicon Valley, he says, is the exception in the sense there are so many different technologies operating simultaneously in Silicon Valley. He says more typical examples of brain hubs are like Boise, Idaho for radio technology, Portland, Oregon for semiconductors, Seattle for a combination of software and now a growing body of life sciences, Boston, mostly in the life sciences, Washington, D.C. Is diversified in terms of private sector innovation. And he points out that most of these clusters are going to be small pockets of a particular industry. And of course, he mentions others, LA being entertainment, Houston, oil and gas, Washington, D.C., government, and all the associated factors of that. So if you talk to anybody that's in politics or in the study of politics or political science, it's hard to find anybody that takes that seriously at some point in time who doesn't want to be in Washington, D.C. I've gone over the years, I've been fortunate on 3 or 4 different occasions to bring groups of students to Washington, D.C. for conferences at some of the larger hotels there. And one of the things I found is that the environment of Washington, D.C. is infectious. You spend your days, visiting as a tourist, going to the Aeronautic and Space Museums or various other places on the mall, or visiting the memorials, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, Jefferson Memorial, things like that. But in the evening, if you go to some of the pubs or the bars or the Irish pubs or the restaurants, you begin to get a sense that even in the middle of the week on a Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Thursday night, these places are alive. They are booming with conversation. And the conversation tends always to revolve around the life of Washington, D.C., which is one variation or the other of its political life. Everybody that you hear, everybody that you engage, everybody at the table next to you in a restaurant is talking about one facet or other of the life of that community, which is politics, which is government, which is public service of one kind or another, which is lobbyists of something. But the fact of the matter is the place is alive. And it doesn't take long to recognize, and I've done this more than once, it doesn't take long to recognize what the attraction of that area is to political junkies, to people who want to get into government service, who want to get into federal employment, who want to get into public service, who want to find a way to connect to one of the staff, to be a lower level staff person for one of the senators or one of the congressmen or one of the agencies or something like that. There just seem to be unlimited opportunities available in an environment like this. And once you experience it, if that indeed is your bent, if that's really what turns you on, then you quickly become aware that there's no place else you want to be other than there. It's where the action is. It's where all the opportunities are. And that's the kind of environment. It's a psychological environment as much as anything. That's the kind of environment I think Moretti is talking about when he talks about these innovation clusters or these so-called brain hubs. It's where you want to be. And it's reflected in housing costs, in living costs. Things are more expensive. Salaries are higher. Opportunities are wider and more available. And so naturally there are costs associated with this, because obviously it takes money. I have a good friend who retired in Florida, as thousands of people have, but he was in education. We taught together for a number of years, and he retired, and he's now in South Florida along the coast in the Fort Lauderdale area. And he's a single dad, and he raised his two sons in that particular community. And I've known him for years. And I remember his two sons when they were in middle school, when they were 12 and 13, 14-year-olds. Now they're adults. They have their own families. But one of the things I remember talking to him about was the nature of living in South Florida, the challenges of living in South Florida. David was in higher education. He was a full-time faculty member at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton. And while he made a good living, being in higher education, he wasn't wealthy. He was a teacher. He wasn't a researcher. He didn't pursue grants. He taught, and he was a darn good teacher. And we kept in touch over the years. I visited him several times. And I can remember him talking about what life is like in South Florida. And he talked about how difficult it was to raise children there because it's so expensive. And he would refer to it as David's Fairyland. Welcome to David's Fairyland, because he felt like he literally died and went to heaven when he ended up relocating to South Florida, was able to find a teaching position there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it was not easy for his children, because everything in South Florida, he made the point, costs money, lots of money. And he said living in South Florida is great if you've got money. But if you don't, it's painful because you're on the outside looking in at all of these activities and you can't participate in them. And he said his salary, while it was adequate for him and adequate for him raising them while they were kids in school, once they became young adults, he could no longer afford to supplement their income enough for them to enjoy life in South Florida. They had to basically become self-sufficient and find ways to feed or to afford their own lifestyle because he couldn't do it. It's that high. And that's what we're talking about, is that kind of an environment. And what you end up doing, I know what his kids did for a while. You end up working service jobs waiting on the people with money. You work in bars or in restaurants or hotels or whatever. And you become a service employee waiting on those people who do have the kind of money to throw around. And looking for the kinds of opportunities that'll get you out of the service sector and into the sector that employs various kinds of services. At the time that he was explaining it to me, it didn't make all that much sense to me. But now it does, because I can understand why South Florida is an innovative area in the thinking of Moretti. This is the kind of area that people want to go to, obviously because of climate, but also the kinds of activity there, the hotels, the tourist industry, and all the rest of it. There are a number of opportunities available for creative, innovative people in that community like others. But again, it costs. I think what Moretti is talking about then is the idea that for economic growth to happen, these kinds of innovative challenges need to be there and need to take off. And once the thing becomes self-sustaining, it seems to work. Many communities have never been able to pull it off, and they die. One of the most interesting things to me as a historian is the fact that as I look at the history of particular areas and regions of the country, I begin to see why, not only why these areas emerged, but more importantly, why they didn't in so many areas. I grew up in New England. I grew up in the midst of the factories, the mills that was so dominant and so prosperous in the late 19th century, middle and late 19th century. Southern cotton coming from the South and being processed in these textile mills. The number of jobs that were available. The number of immigrants that immigrated into the country from overseas to take advantage of the employment opportunities in these mills. Now many of these communities are dead. The factories, the old mills, sit there empty. Some of them have been converted into malls, into outlet stores of various kinds. But as many sit idle and empty as there are that have found new ways to live. And if those areas weren't able to move into the modern era, then they would die as well. And that's what happened in many areas of the so-called Rust Belt in the upper Midwest, which is becoming the focal point of the presidential election. Most of the swing states, so-called, Ohio, Pennsylvania, many of these areas are overcome economically with areas that have died, where industry have died, where the mills have closed, where steel has moved overseas, where coal production has died along with it. And many of these communities have not been able to find new ways to sustain their life and to breathe new life into them. Some have. I would recommend, if any of you ever get the chance, to visit Pittsburgh. I can remember in the mid 20th century, in 50s and 60s, Pittsburgh was a mill coal town where the air was so thick you could see it. And it was not considered a healthy environment. It was not considered a good environment. It was an environment that people had to learn to live in because there were jobs there. But when the industrial jobs petered out, the communities tended to die. But Pittsburgh has been able to rebound. It is now clean. It is beautiful. One of the most beautiful experiences I think you can have is to drive from northern West Virginia across the river into Pittsburgh, across the bridges into Pittsburgh. It is absolutely gorgeous. And so much has been done to revitalize downtown Pittsburgh. Athletic facilities and high-tech industries and all the rest of it. And part of the reason, obviously, is because of the availability of higher education research universities in the area. Carnegie Mellon, West Virginia University in Morgantown, and many others. I think one of the concerns, one of the negatives that we have here in West Virginia is that our major research university is in Morgantown, which is in the upper edge of the state of West Virginia. So the fact of the matter is most of the benefits of the research university don't tend to flow south into the middle of West Virginia. They seem to flow north towards Pittsburgh. And that particular area is vital because of that research university and a number of others. Again, I don't like to beat this issue to death. But at the same time, I think that Moretti is touching on something that all of us need to understand and look for and recognize and appreciate. Because in a dynamic, challenging, international economic system driven by technology and driven by more heated, competitive environment worldwide, it seems to me that communities are going to have to look for and find ways, niches, to make themselves self-sustaining. One of the problems with that is, we've talked about this research before, is that it's very, very true that the key, and Moretti says this in his interview on NPR, the key is the willingness to invest in people. Areas that are wealthy in natural resources tend not to make the appropriate investments in people. And so consequently, the levels of education and the levels of economic vibrancy, if you will, tend to be less in regions like West Virginia, where I broadcast from, because it has traditionally been wealthy in natural resources, and most of the state's wealth has been invested in extracting the wealth and marketing the wealth outside the state and around the world, and the investment in people has not been made. And consequently, when the wealth deteriorates, as we've seen here with coal and the rest of it, then people are left floundering and helpless. And that's what I think we are experiencing here. So, again, I really do believe that these issues are critically important. And I would really welcome your input or your thoughts on some of these particular areas, because I do believe that they are extremely relevant and extremely important. There was one additional thing that area that I wanted to touch on, and it's the Truth Out article that we spent time on yesterday when we were talking about the gig economy. The more I thought about that last night and after our program yesterday, the thought of organized labor, and again, when people think of organized labor, they think of unions in a 20th century industrial context. I think that what we traditionally call organized labor is going to have to reinvent itself in a lot of ways in order to remain relevant in the kind of dynamic, technology-driven world that we find ourselves in. What I'm particularly struck by were the numbers and the predictions about the number of jobs, the numbers of people that are going to be involved in this so-called gig economy, this high-tech economy where work becomes part-time, becomes very specialized, but is not full-time and doesn't come with the kind of traditional benefits and security opportunities that have traditionally been associated with labor. Very honestly then, as this particular article makes clear, the opportunities to exploit employees is becoming a real problem as the so-called gig economy continues to grow. The author of this article, Peter Ruff, gives us different names. I like the gig economy because it has a little ring to it that seems to be easy to remember. But he refers to it as what some people call a sharing economy, an on-demand economy. The assumption is that there is a relationship, he says, between consumers, software, and workers. And it's this that labor seeks to address. And employees are looking for this kind of very flexible, mobile, highly skilled labor that they can buy for a short period of time and not assume any responsibilities or any liability for it. If you are in the business of providing this kind of a skill, then it seems to me you're more and more in a situation where you're going to have to look out for yourself. And that becomes impossible. And that's usually what has led to the idea of labor organizing, employees organizing together, recognizing the opportunities in numbers for strength and negotiating power. The fact of the matter is, the estimates are that 30% of today's workforce is involved in this kind of work. My own wife is. We've been talking about that over the last couple of days. She is classified as a subcontractor, as an independent contractor. She signs on to serve clients to deliver a particular product. When that product has been delivered, she's done. The company that has employed her has set her up with the opportunity for work, but it has assumed no liability or no responsibility for her at all. It's up to her to handle her own withholding. It's up to her to provide her own transportation, her own insurance, her own protection, all of it. It's a totally different kind of work world for more and more people. But it's a world of work that is being defined and driven by technology, by the information revolution. And it seems to me that the future of organized labor is going to be driven in large part by how successful labor is in defining and wrapping its arms around this challenge and being able to come up with opportunities that make organization more attractive and more beneficial for employees. I think the opportunities currently for employees, labor, to be exploited are immense in this kind of a system. I talked yesterday about my dad and putting his name on an office and what that meant, how little that meant in terms of expenditures for the employer and how much it meant psychologically to him. So calling somebody an independent contractor, calling secretaries in business administrative assistants, the implication is that they have a role to play in administration, but ultimately they lose all the benefits of being an hourly employee. In higher education, for example, here in West Virginia, public employment, being a public employee in higher education here, is in two categories. One are hourly employees who are paid overtime, who have certain protections, negotiated protections, and all the rest of it. And then there is this other group, this amorphous group, which are who are much like independent contractors, in that they work on a contractual basis, but they are not paid by the hour. So in theory, they must work as many hours as the job calls for in order to be completed. So they don't have the kinds of protections that hourly employees do. Those kinds of positions are becoming more and more attractive to employers, to organizations, to institutions, because they come with all the benefits for the employer and few of the responsibilities or liabilities. I think this article is important because it really reveals a real danger of being exploited. And, in that sense, I think all of us need to be aware of it. So again, if that's a particular area of interest to you, I do invite you to give us a call. I'm checking the time. We have about 10 minutes left in this, our first hour, and then we will take our 5-minute break, and we'll go into a totally different issue. What I'd like to do in the next few moments before we do take our break is kind of set up what I think our second hour will be focusing on. And for lack of a better term, I think probably the way to introduce it is to mention a term that all of us are familiar with. And that's the idea of so-called affirmative action. The kind of environment, the kind of legal environment, which in theory prevents discrimination, makes it illegal or more difficult to discriminate against particular groups of people, to treat individuals or particular groups as second-class citizens in any way. Most of us, when we hear the term affirmative action, think of race. One of the most interesting things I've learned in doing some background reading on this is that the whole idea of affirmative action, at least in this country, was born in the 1930s during the New Deal. And it was principally focused on labor, on the threats and the dangers of exploiting workers, which seems to me is kind of a fairly smooth connection from the topic that we've just been talking about. The fact of the matter is, racial discrimination prior to World War II was so rampant in the country that nobody associated it with affirmative action. Affirmative action was based more on class than it was on race during Roosevelt's New Deal. And some of the later New Deal legislation, like the Fair Employment Responsibilities Act, I think it's called, FERA, Fair Employment Responsibilities Act, which made it illegal to discriminate against people in the workforce, individuals based on nationality or those kinds of things. And of course, race for the most part wasn't involved because people racially weren't even allowed to participate in some of the protections that became so synonymous with the New Deal. In fact, if one looks back, that's one of the negatives about Roosevelt's New Deal, is that it didn't do anything about racial discrimination in the country at all. All of that begins after World War II, primarily during the 60s, during the Civil Rights Movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which basically addresses the issue of discrimination based principally on race. So that's the issue I'd like to talk about. And of course, the thing that sparks it, the issue that really brings all of this to the fore, it seems to me, is the protest that has been underway for the last several weeks that was initiated by Colin Kaepernick of the San Francisco 49ers and his refusal to stand for the national anthem. And much of the criticism that he received initially has pretty much dissipated as more and more people have chimed in. And if you remember, Kaepernick's position was that he finds it impossible to stand and pledge his support for a nation that continues to discriminate against African Americans, that continues to treat certain citizens as second-class citizens rather than as equal citizens to everybody else. Some people find that or see that as misplaced, especially for a professional football player like Kaepernick, who is in the midst of a multi-million-dollar contract. In other words, to some people, it's fine to take a position, but on the other hand, you haven't done anything financially to put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. Well, the fact of the matter is Kaepernick has. He's been engaged in a number of activities in and around San Francisco, various kinds of charity works and various other things which are designed to use his good fortune to the benefit of those people who are in trouble in his community. So the debate goes as to whether, in fact, this is a valid way to protest, this is a valid way to produce change in this country, or whatever. It seems to me that there are some issues raised here that really need to be pursued. And that is why our efforts in the area of creating equality, racial equality in this country, have been less than successful. Some people argue that affirmative action has been the most successful way to at least begin the process of ending racial discrimination in this country. Other people believe that affirmative action has had just the opposite effect, that it has produced reverse discrimination, and that people of race have benefited from opportunities based only on the fact that they are of a particular race. And that has resulted in the fact that people who are not of that race are being discriminated against. In other words, that white Caucasians have suffered under affirmative action. I can speak myself to my own experience when I was unemployed in the mid-1980s. And I used to say facetiously, but it's not totally untrue, that I sent out enough resumes and enough application letters for jobs that I literally could have papered a room in rejection letters. But the fact of the matter is, I did receive a couple of rejection letters which explained to me that the reason I did not receive or get an interview or be given an opportunity to secure a particular position is because affirmative action guidelines made it necessary for the particular employer to allocate certain positions to non-whites, to minorities. And because I was not a minority, therefore I was not in the final race or competition for that particular position. I can remember one specific letter I got which said basically that I was the best qualified candidate to apply for the position, but because the position was considered and required to go to a minority applicant, that I basically was taken out of the running for that particular position. We know that there have been a number of legal suits and cases to come before the Supreme Court over issues related to affirmative action in higher education, in law school specifically, where a certain number of slots were reserved for minority applicants. And what that meant was that in certain cases, qualified Caucasians, non-minorities, were denied access to those particular positions because of the so-called affirmative action requirements. So it is not without reason that some people claim reverse discrimination to be a product of affirmative action efforts in this country. When we come back after our break, I'd like to pursue this, and I'd like to do it from a historical perspective. And what I mean is, this particular issue was on the table at the turn not of this century, but the last century, the transition from the 19th into the 20th century. And it's specifically related to those numbers of Black Americans who were released from slavery as a result of the Civil War and the so-called Civil War amendments passed at the end of the Civil War. The result was that there was a major debate within the Black community at the turn of the century into the 20th century. And the two most prominent names associated with that debate were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a faculty member at Harvard University. Those two individuals laid out the issues in terms of what is the best way to resolve racial discrimination in this country. I can remember when I taught this in history classes over the years. I can remember making the point, because some of my students made the point, that if you really read these arguments and digest them, everything that one might need to know about the issue of racial discrimination in this country is addressed in these documents. There's not much associated with this topic that isn't addressed in this particular debate. So what I'd like to do in our second hour, and hopefully we'll finish it, but if we don't, we'll just extend it into our next program as well. What I'd like to do is share with you these two positions so that we can examine them, compare them, contrast them, look at the negatives and the positives of both, and try to arrive at some sort of understanding, if you will, more thorough understanding of what all is involved in this particular issue. Obviously, I think it's extremely important. It is directly related to the Constitution of the United States because it relates directly to the issue of discrimination and equality of treatment in our society. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have turned the top of the hour. We're about 4 minutes after the hour. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, we're going to look at Booker T. Washington's Atlanta Compromise speech delivered in Atlanta, Georgia in the year 1895. If you want to go online and look up that document, I would encourage you to do it because we're going to be into that document when we come back. Please, I want to thank you and invite you back. We'll be right back. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour. We're at 9 minutes after the hour on this Wednesday. It is the 28th day of September, in the year 2016. It is a pleasure to be with you. If you are just joining us, welcome to today's program. I think you're going to be in for 45 minutes of some pretty interesting and engaging insight and information as we begin to look at a couple of the major historical documents related to the issues of racial discrimination in our nation. If you are just joining us, welcome. If you have been with us through our first hour, then I want to thank you for staying with us into our second hour. We are launching into a different new topic here in the second hour, and it is a topic spurred by the protests of Colin Kaepernick and those athletes who have joined him in protesting against the national anthem at sporting events in order to make clear their concerns over the issue of racial discrimination, especially the issues related to Black Lives Matter and the number of shooting of unarmed black males by police throughout the country. It continues. It seems like one after the other. Every couple of days there seems to be a new one. And obviously the debate has focused around the issue or the difference between Black Lives Matter and the counter-argument that all lives matter. Nobody questions the fact that all lives matter. But I think the message of the Black Lives Matter movement ought to be pretty obvious for those willing to think seriously about it, because the suggestion is that historically, at least in our nation, black lives to a lot of people have not mattered, or have not mattered equally with white lives, with Caucasian lives. And that ultimately is the issue. It's clearly one of the most disturbing and difficult challenges that this nation has faced and continues to face as we move into the midst of the 21st century. We're in the year 2016 now, moving toward the end of it, and we continue to have these debates. I think many people have wanted to believe at various points throughout our history that this issue has been resolved. I think some people really believed when the Civil War was over and slavery became illegal. I really believed that some people thought that was the end of the issues associated with race in this country. As we know, however, it really wasn't, because slavery was replaced by a system of segregation that ultimately engulfed the southern part of the United States legally, because specific laws made it permissible. And in many of our northern cities, we ended up with very segregated situations, schools, neighborhoods, etc. But the issues related to that were that the segregation wasn't a matter of law. And the argument is that people have a right to live with whomever they want. Certain people choose to live with their own kind. And so therefore we're dealing with a segregated society. And we know that the Supreme Court in 1974 followed up the school integration decision with the busing decision, which commanded forced busing in order to produce an integrated society, because the decisions were made that suggested that a society divided on the basis of race is a society that cannot reach its full potential. The assumption is that somehow we needed to get beyond the issues of race. We have yet to do that. I think the situation that's going on right now makes very clear that we have yet to do that. I think if we go back 100 and some odd years into the late 19th century, we can begin to see some of the issues and some of the considerations that would help to inform the concerns and the issues that we all faced. Let me be specific. In 1895, Booker T. Washington delivered the opening address at the Atlanta Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta on the 18th of September, 1895. Today we're at the 28th of September. This was on the 18th in the year 1895. Booker T. Washington was invited to speak to the Atlanta Exposition. And in that speech, which has gone down in history as his so-called Atlanta Compromise speech, Booker T. Washington laid out the circumstances or the ingredients or the terms, if you will, of a deal, of a set of choices that the white South had to make in terms of how to deal with the millions of blacks who had been recently released from slavery. This exposition in Atlanta was held in order to celebrate industrial growth in the South, the emergence of industry in southern states, which up to this point had been traditionally agricultural, principally, obviously, cotton. Leaders in the white South were working hard to diversify the economy of the South. And the issue for Booker T. Washington as a leader of the black community in the South, and the issue for the white South as well, was what exactly is to be the role of blacks in the emergence or the growth of the so-called New South. The concerns were, will ex-slaves be included in the growth of the New South, the industrial South? Or will blacks be excluded from participation in this process? Booker T. Washington had a plan. Leaders of the white South invited him to deliver this plan and make this speech to the industrial leadership of the New South. It is a plan that has been debated ever since it was first introduced. Some people believe that Booker T. Washington's approach was the only realistic one that stood any chance of being successful. Other people believed that in this speech, Washington sold out the interests of his own race in return for the promise of inclusion, that in effect, he invited continued discrimination and really asked for a divided society divided by race. That was the position that W.E.B. Du Bois took in opposition to Booker T. Washington. When Washington delivered his speech in 1895, in the year 1903, 8 years later, Du Bois published his book called The Souls of Black Folk. And in that study, in that book, Du Bois took Washington to task for the compromises that Washington had made with the white South. He basically criticized Washington for asking black people to give up three things. First, political power. Second, insistence on their civil rights. And third, higher education of black children, black young people. And to concentrate all of their energies on industrial education, the accumulation of wealth, and the conciliation of the white South. As a result of this speech, Du Bois said, Washington had effectively extended a palm branch, an olive branch, to the white South. And what has been the result? 8 years later, Du Bois asks. He said the result of that speech has been the disenfranchisement of the Negro American, the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for blacks, and third, the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of black Americans. In other words, Washington had sold out equal treatment of his race in return for an opportunity to begin at the bottom and work their way, blacks starting at the bottom and working their way to the top by doing the menial labor, the physical labor. Du Bois came up with an alternative. And that's really the issue that explains this particular debate, I believe. I think what we're going to find is Du Bois and others who criticize Washington in many cases misplace or misinterpret what he exactly did in the Atlanta Compromise speech. I think in the process, in many cases, they fail to appreciate the circumstances within which Washington had to work. I think they don't give Washington credit for his reading of the realities of the social and political situation that black Americans in the South found themselves in. But that's my conclusion. I'd like to share with you some of Washington's terms and the way he laid out his case in his Atlanta Compromise speech, if I may. Washington says, 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeking the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success. Period. It seems to me in that opening sentence, Washington is laying out the circumstances that the white South finds itself in. Namely, 1/3 of the population of the South in 1895 is black. That means that 1/3 of the population will either contribute to the growth and expansion of the South or will be excluded from those opportunities and become effectively an anchor that limits the growth of the New South. 1/3 of the population is significant. The question that Washington is laying before his audience, which remember is the white industrial leadership of the post-Civil War South. The terms that Washington is laying out to them is the potential of the South, with all of us working together in the same direction and pulling together, the potential, the economic potential, growth potential of the South is unlimited. But if the Southern white population chooses to not include blacks in this industrial expansion, then the non-participation of 1/3 of the population will hold back the development of the other 2/3. It will weigh on Southern society like an anchor, because this group is going to have to be pulled along if it's not allowed to work in tandem with the leadership. This is 1895. It's dealing with the racial situation in the post-Civil War South. 1895 is the period when racial discrimination, segregation, is becoming rampant throughout the South. Washington sees this. Washington sees that state after state is passing legislation which is effectively isolating blacks from participation in the future of Southern growth and expansion. He sees the threat of being excluded. He's trying to make the case to the people who can do something about it that there is an alternative, and that it's the only viable alternative for the South if it really wants to have a chance to reach the region's full potential. I think this is what Washington is talking about. It's a compromise. It's a deal. I would suggest to you that the very nature of a compromise or a deal involves choices. He is giving the Southern white leadership choices. Include us, and together we can go to unbelievable extremes. Don't include us, and we'll hold you back. You will never get to where you might go if you include us. And I think we all have to remember that this is happening. This speech is being delivered against the backdrop of segregation legislation which is sweeping Southern states at the time. And by this time, you've got a conservative Supreme Court that is condoning segregation. In the very next year, 1896, I believe it's 2 years later, excuse me, I think it's 1898, the Supreme Court in the railroad case of Plessy versus Ferguson is going to legitimize the constitutionality of a segregated, racially separated society. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court finds that the races can be divided so long as each race is provided equal accommodations. In other words, the Supreme Court is announcing to the South that you can have separate accommodations, separate railroad cars, separate facilities, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains, separate schools, separate churches. The only thing the Constitution requires is that the accommodations offered to all groups be equal. As long as you provide blacks equal accommodations to whites, then they can be separate. It's going to take better than another half century before the argument settles in that by definition, being segregated or separated is effectively to be discriminated against. The only way equality is possible, the Supreme Court says in 1954, is if the schools are integrated. The 1954 Brown decision, of course, relates to schools in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas. It's education. The 1898 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson is a railroad case, separate railroad cars for blacks and whites. And the Supreme Court in the late 19th century rules that you can have separate cars as long as the accommodations are relatively equal. Washington in 1895 sees this. He sees the trend. He sees what's happening in the South. And he's obviously moving to try to nip this in the bud, to stop it before it goes any further. It seems to me that's the context within which this speech is delivered. And if you keep that context in mind, then many of the things that Washington says, which appear to be a sellout, are really very clever negotiating terms. He is making a case. And I don't think that a lot of people are willing to give him credit for that case. Let me pause for a moment and make this particular issue, or at least mention this particular issue, because I think it's relevant. Some of us are probably saying to ourselves, this is great, but this is 1895. What does this have to do with today? I would suggest to you that our society is confronted with a very, very similar situation that Washington was dealing with in 1895 in Atlanta. We have a situation, an economic situation in this country today where the nation is being confronted with similar choices. Because with the emergence of the so-called new capitalism, we are witnessing more and more people being rendered unemployable, according to Richard Sennett, useless in the new, vibrant, mobile, flexible, technological, capitalist economy. More and more people are being rendered non-contributors to the new capitalism. They don't have the skills, they don't have the intelligence, they don't have the training necessary to contribute. Consequently, they become baggage. Here in West Virginia, for example, West Virginia is in the unique situation where more than 50% of its working age adult population is unemployed. That means that fewer than half of the working age population in West Virginia is carrying the other half. Realistically, how much economic growth can there be when half the people are not contributing to it, but are actually detrimental to it? That is pretty much the same situation that Booker T. Washington is laying out to the white Southern industrial leadership at this exposition. If you include us, we can all go forward together. But if you don't, you'll never get where you hope to get. Because we will be like an anchor, holding you down, holding you back. So again, it seems to me what goes around comes around. Many of the same circumstances and situations are at play here as were then. Washington says in his speech, second paragraph, not only this, but the opportunity here afforded will awaken among us a new era of industrial progress. Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life, we began at the top instead of at the bottom, that a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill, that the political convention or stump speaking had more attractions than starting a dairy farm or a truck garden. What is Washington saying there? He's going back to the Reconstruction South at the end of the Civil War. If you remember your history books, during Reconstruction, many of the post-Civil War Southern states began to fill the legislatures with ex-slaves, with black leaders. The assumption was that now that slavery was gone, blacks could play a meaningful integrated role in the post-Civil War South. That brought on segregation. That caused a negative reaction on the part of the white South. And the white South moved to discriminate, segregate, and exclude blacks from participation in Southern society. That's the reality that Washington is confronting. What he's doing here then in the second paragraph is acknowledging that we were wrong. We tried to make up for lost time by starting at the top. We were mistaken. And what he's basically saying is, we know better now. We're willing to accept the realities of our position. We're willing to start at the bottom. That becomes the focus of criticism among many black leaders, not only at that time, but afterwards. And then Washington engages in one of the most famous clauses or statements from this particular speech. He says, a ship lost at sea for many days suddenly sighted a friendly vessel. From the mast of the unfortunate vessel was seen the signal, water, water, we die of thirst. The answer from the friendly vessel at once came back, cast down your bucket where you are. A second time the signal, water, water, send us water, ran up from the distressed vessel, and was answered again, cast down your bucket where you are. And a third and fourth signal for water was answered, cast down your bucket where you are. The captain of the distressed vessel, at last heeding the injunction, cast down his bucket, and it came up full of fresh sparkling water from the mouth of the Amazon River. To those of my race, Washington says, who depend on bettering their condition in a foreign land, or who underestimate the importance of cultivating friendly relations with the southern white man who is their next door neighbor, I would say, Washington says, cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down in making friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom we are surrounded. The message, cast down your buckets where you are, applies to both blacks and whites from Washington's perspective. To blacks, he is saying, cast down your buckets where you are. If you need to start at the bottom and work your way up, then accept that and do it. Because the opportunities to be successful are better than not having the opportunities at all. To the white South, he is saying, we're already here. We are a labor force. Southern growth is going to require manual labor. We're here, all of us. Cast down your buckets where you are and include us in your goal or your dream of progress. Cast it down, Washington says, in agriculture, mechanics, commerce, in domestic service, and in the professions. Our greatest danger, Washington said, is that in the great leap from slavery to freedom, we may overlook the fact that the masses of us are to live by the production of our hands, and fail to keep in mind that we shall prosper in proportion as we learn to dignify and glorify common labor and put brains and skill into the common occupations in life, shall prosper in proportion as we learn to draw the line between the superficial and the substantial, the ornamental gewgaws of life and the useful. No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. It is at the bottom of life we must begin, not at the top. Nor should we permit our grievances to overshadow our opportunities. In reality, what Washington is doing is laying claim for blacks to the manual labor opportunities in a dynamic, growing economic environment. He is basically acknowledging, we're willing to start here. Just give us the chance, Washington is saying. To those of the white race, he says, who look to the incoming of those those of foreign birth and strange tongue and habits for the prosperity of the South, were I permitted, I would repeat what I say to my own race: cast down your bucket where you are. Washington sees the potential of thousands, tens of thousands of immigrants coming into the country to provide the manual labor for the economic growth in the South. If that happens, Washington realizes, then his people, ex-slaves, will be denied the opportunities that industrial growth promises. So what he's basically saying to the white South is, don't import foreigners to do the work, let us do it. We will willingly accept the menial positions at the bottom rather than be totally excluded from the process. And of course, the terms of the deal are really important. If the South buys this offer, then blacks will be included in economic expansion. But if the leaders of the South do not buy into the compromise, then blacks will be segregated and excluded. And Washington is using every rhetorical device he can think of to make the case to the white South that they shouldn't do that. He said, cast down your buckets among the 8 million Negroes whose habits you know, whose fidelity and love you have tested in days when to have proved treacherous meant the ruin of your firesides. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, builded your railroads and cities, and brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth, and helped make possible this magnificent representation of the progress of the South. What he is saying to the white South is, let us be your labor force. We aren't forming unions. We aren't striking. We aren't making demands. All we want is an opportunity. He is basically trying, I think, to make the case that their best shot at economic expansion is to include rather than exclude the ex-slaves. Casting down your bucket among my people, he says, helping them as you are doing on these grounds, and to education of head, hand, and heart, you will find that they will buy your surplus land, make blossom the waste places in your fields, and run your factories. While doing this, you can be sure in the future, as in the past, that you and your families will be surrounded by the most patient, faithful, law-abiding, unresentful people that the world has ever seen. What he is promising is if given the opportunity, blacks will just do their job and demand nothing else. We'll be peaceful, we'll be friendly, we'll be patient. All we want is a chance. Again, all of this is in the context of the very clear evidence that immigration is flooding into the country and that there would be a tendency to give these menial labor opportunities to immigrants rather than to the black community. That's the term, that's the threat that Washington is facing. And then he raises the magic question: social integration as well as economic integration. Washington says, in all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. This is one of the most famous sentences of this particular speech. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. All we want is economic opportunity. We're not demanding to live in your neighborhoods. We're not demanding to go to school with your kids. We're not threatening to marry your daughter, your women. We're not threatening to demand equality in transportation or any place else. We are willing to accept status as remaining segregated, separate. We will be as separate as the fingers on your hand. But if you give us economic opportunity, then together we will become the power of a closed fist. We'll be together with you when it benefits all of us. We'll be separate from you in the areas that you want to make sure we remain separate. We're not making any demands that you can't live with or that you're not comfortable with, is what Washington is saying. Then he moves into a paragraph which begins, nearly 16 million hands will aid you in pulling the load upwards, or they will pull against you the load downwards. There is the challenge. There is the term. There is the gauntlet for the white South. Notice he has said a couple of paragraphs ago, 8 million Negroes in the South. Now he's saying 16 million hands, 2 hands per person. Think of the rhetorical power of 8 million, of 16 million hands. Think of the rhetorical power of the numbers. And what he is saying is, we are 16 million hands who can aid you in pulling the load upwards, or we can pull against you the load downwards. It's your call, your choice, your decision. You include us, we go forward. You don't include us, not only are we held back, but we will hold you back as well. Your call. I would suggest to you that if you look at it in those terms, this really doesn't constitute a sellout. It constitutes, in my mind at least, a very shrewd proposal where much of the evidence is marshaled to point out the positives of making the right decision, but as well to lay out the negatives should these Southern white leaders choose to make the wrong decision. Again, I think this is incredibly important. This may be the most important paragraph in the whole speech. We shall constitute 1/3 and more of the ignorance and crime of the South, or 1/3 its intelligence and progress. We shall contribute 1/3 to the business and industrial prosperity of the South, or we shall provide a veritable body of death, stagnating, depressing, retarding every effort to advance the body politic. If you include us, we go forward. If you don't, we'll hold you back. Your call, your choice. You better make the right one, is what Washington is saying. He goes on and says, this is toward the end of the speech, no race that has anything to contribute to the markets of the world is long in any degree ostracized. It is important and right that all privileges of the law be ours, but it is vastly more important that we be prepared for the exercises of these privileges. The opportunity to earn $1 in a factory just now is worth infinitely more than the opportunity to spend $1 in an opera house. What Washington is saying here, which I think is incredibly important, is that we recognize the situation. We know where we stand on the priority list here. We're willing to start at the bottom. But notice he says, no race that has anything to contribute and right that all privileges of the law be ours. It is important because no race that has anything to contribute is long ostracized. This is part of the plan, part of the deal, part of the compromise. We recognize that if we start at the bottom, you'll be giving us the same opportunities to move up that everyone else has. This is a key part of the whole document because Washington is saying we want the same opportunities that you guys have. We'll start at the bottom, but you need to give us the opportunities to move up as we demonstrate that we're worthy of taking advantage of these opportunities. In other words, what he's doing here is saying, we can't start at the bottom and then you close off the opportunities and force us to remain forever at the bottom. That's not the way it works. So what he's laying out here are part of his terms. We'll start at the bottom, but you make sure we're given the opportunities to move up, the same ones that you have. That's what free enterprise capitalism is about. That's what makes capitalism the potential growth engine that it is. Everybody must start at the bottom and be willing to work, but everybody has an opportunity to be rewarded for that work by moving up. We're no different. We want the same opportunities as everybody else has. If we're willing to start at the bottom, you need to make sure that we're not forever condemned to remain at the bottom. I would suggest to you that that paragraph constitutes the white South's response. Washington anticipates it. He recognizes what they might do, namely buy the terms of the contract, but close the opportunities that are associated with it. And as we know, that's indeed what does happen. And it's for that Washington is being most criticized by Du Bois and by others. Before we get off Washington, we've only got about 5 minutes left in today's program. We don't have the time to do Du Bois today. We can basically hold him off until next week. But let me make just a couple of general concluding comments about Washington here. More specifically, by going back to the Colin Kaepernick protests. To what extent is Kaepernick's refusal to stand for the national anthem effective? What I mean is Kaepernick effectively making the same kind of deal that Booker T. Washington tried to make in 1895? Is Kaepernick saying, we'll stand for your national anthem, but you need to start treating us as equal citizens? Our lives matter. We want you to recognize that. We want you to treat us the way other people are treated. The question I'm asking you to think about is, how different is Kaepernick's protest than was Booker T. Washington's protest? I would suggest that Kaepernick is really giving all of the options and all the leverage to mainstream white society. He's basically saying, I'll stand and pledge my honor to the nation when you're willing to fulfill your promises to us as citizens in this nation. But again, how powerful, how much of a threat is refusal to stand for the national anthem? How much is Kaepernick investing in this? He still retains his multi-million-dollar contract. How much power is invested in Kaepernick's position? The answer to that question, I would suggest, is unfolding as we speak. More and more people are buying into this protest. But it doesn't really cost anything to refuse to stand for the national anthem. If you remember Tortelli, the hockey coach, who makes the statement, if one of our players doesn't stand, he'll sit for the whole game. He'll sit for the whole season. In other words, you'll stand and honor the nation or you won't play. But the NFL is a business. They're not willing to not use the talent that they've got. So the question is, it appears that white society has most of the advantage here. They can promise to do a lot of things, but whether in fact they deliver is questionable. That's the same circumstances in which Booker T. Washington was involved. Namely, he laid out the terms, but he also laid out what might happen. We expect the same opportunities for advancement that other people have had. Obviously, we know that on that part of the deal, the white South never delivered. And the result was the continued expansion of segregation in the South and the denial of job opportunities in the South. We're at the end of our day. I misjudged my time here, and I apologize for that. We're at 59 minutes after the hour, and I guess our time together for this week is done. I want to thank you so much for being with us. I hope that you'll tune in again next week on Monday to the Virtual Center. Please continue to support the Hit On Radio Network. I want to thank you for it. I want to thank you for your continued support of this program. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and a wonderful weekend. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.